The Old Testament reading is 1 Kings, chapter 19, beginning with the first verse. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. And there he came to a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go forth, and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king." So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing, with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
This passage that Leanne just read to us comes right on the heels of Elijah's great victory at Mount Carmel over the Canaanite prophets. If you know the story, he has a contest with these Canaanite prophets, and he soundly defeats them, and then he slaughters hundreds of them. And then we have this story. I mean, isn't that the kind of stuff in the Bible that just makes you crazy, right? It seems to be something cool happening, but then Canaanite prophets are slaughtered. Like, what's that about? And I suspect that the point of this, if we dig deep, is the following. Religious victories are always Pyrrhic victories. You remember this in school? The Pyrrhic victory, like you win, but then there's so much disaster tucked inside of it, it's really like a loss. Religious victories are always Pyrrhic victories. You can think of a bunch in the Middle Ages. The Christian Crusaders went off to Palestine and they conquered the Christians, but then the Muslims came back and conquered the Christians. They're Pyrrhic victories. None of it was of God. In our denomination recently, we've had people proclaiming victory. Back in February, after our general conference, conservatives, traditionalists said, we won. In the last couple of weeks, progressives of the denomination, various places, have been saying, we're winning now. And in God's church, there aren't sides. In God's church, there aren't winners and losers. In God's church, there's no such thing as a religious victory. If there's a religious victory, it's a Pyrrhic victory. I read something a couple of years ago about Rabbi Jonathan Sacks that's really helped me with this passage because, like you, I was bugged over the idea that God's prophet would slaughter all of these Canaanites, even if they did have bad theology. What Jonathan Sacks points out, this is always so cool. Sometimes if you read the Bible slowly and carefully, you notice some things you didn't notice before. And he helps me see something that I had not noticed, which is this. Elijah has this contest. He slaughters the Canaanites, and Sachs points out that God did not ask him to do this. God didn't say, go have a contest with the Canaanites. God did not say, thou shalt slaughter the Canaanites. No, Elijah just went and did it, and what Sachs believes, and I agree with him, is that the Bible lifts up Elijah here as an example of religious zealotry gone bad. That can happen, right? People have so much religious zeal and then it goes bad and harm is done. I think that's what happened with Elijah. I mean, after all, if Elijah did something that God was really delighted about, God should have thrown Elijah a ticker tape parade and let him go live on an island somewhere. But instead, Elijah, he's sick, he's depressed, he's hounded, he's harassed, and he's so depressed that he's out in the middle of nowhere, and if you heard Leanne read it, Elijah slumps under, it says, a solitary broom tree, right? Like, this tree is as lonely as Elijah. The broom tree is as pitiful as Elijah. And Elijah, in this reduced state, he says, Leanne read it, it said, it is enough. That's 4 syllables. In the original Hebrew, it's just 1 syllable. It's Rav. It's not even like a sentence. It's like just a yelp. It's like a cry. It's like a groan. Elijah just says, Rav. Like, it is enough. Rav. He's had it. It is enough. By the way, we're going to do a series this fall on this business of enough. And we're going to ask 2 questions. One question is, how much is enough for us? You can begin pondering that between now and September. The other thing we're going to look at, though, is when do God's people say, this is enough? What's going on is not right with us, and we're going to do something. Elijah hollers, Rav, it is enough. And so then he leaves and he goes to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. This is where God spoke to Moses. I don't know what Elijah's motivation was. Maybe he thought, God will speak to me. God will give me some relief. God will give me some comfort if I go to the mountain of God. And he gets actually the opposite of this. He gets to Mount Horeb and they have like a big electrical storm like we had last night. You know, I understand a number of you do not have power. And I started to say, you get extra credit for coming today. But then I noticed people that are like plugging their phones in to recharge them and all, so maybe it helps you to come. I don't know. They had a big electrical storm and there's an earthquake and Elijah's there and oh my God, there's thunder and lightning, an earthquake and rocks are flying and he is absolutely terrified. And then the text says this amazing thing. It says God was not in the storm. God was not in the wind. God was not in the fire. God was in the still, small voice. That's great, except I think it's even better. The original Hebrew, it might mean still small voice, but the original Hebrew is kol demama daka. Kol demama daka, which might mean still small voice, but it might also just mean utter silence. God was in the kol demama daka. God was in the utter silence. I want to tell you a story. I know a few of you have heard it before, but it bears repeating. When my daughter Sarah turned 25 years old, I don't know where my wife was. She was out of town, so I drove to Durham. Sarah was in grad school at Duke there to have lunch with her. It was a beautiful spring day. We sat outside. We just had a grand time. I was so proud of her. We were just having a blast. And it was time for me to go home. So I said, well, honey, I need to be heading back. And she said, well, now, Dad, before you leave, there's something I need to tell you. Right? Children shouldn't talk to their parents this way. And I said, well, what is it? And then she added, and don't tell Mom. Well, it's getting worse, right? So I braced myself. I say, yeah? And Sarah says, Daddy, I got a tattoo. And I said, nothing. And then she asked me, she said, would you like to see it? I didn't know the answer to this question. And so she pulled her hair back and she says, look, she said, you're the only dad on earth who can even understand this tattoo. So you need to see it. And I look close, right under her ear, that little piece of skin right there under your ear, it looks like just a gray smudge at first. I said, honey, what is it? She said, look closely. And I looked more closely and I realized these were Hebrew letters. She said, "What does it say? What does it say?" And I looked and I read, and it said, "Kol de mama daka." Still small voice, utter silence. She said, are you disappointed I got this tattoo? I'm like, yeah, I'm disappointed my daughter got a Bible verse under her ear. I love that. Mother Teresa often used to say, God is a friend of silence. And God is a friend of silence, and our problem is we're not friends with silence. We Americans in the year 2019 generally are profoundly uncomfortable with silence. But silence is such a beautiful thing if we give it some thought. I wish you'd been here at 9:45. You know, we now have Felicia is working for us now. She's an interpreter, and she interprets for people that can't hear the service, for people on live stream and so on. And Felicia is just this buoyant, beautiful. I was making her translate all of this at 9:45. This is great fun. She's having to tell everybody that Felicia is beautiful. It was great. And she has this beautiful spirit about her. But what I was saying is that this interpretation is amazing because for people for whom there is no sound, there's still this wonder of words passing between people going on. There's still love going on. There's still a connection, even in the total silence. I've told some of you before about the woman that came to my church about 20 years ago. And she was very hard of hearing, and she got harder and harder of hearing, and finally she grew to be totally deaf. Even the hearing assistance things wouldn't help her anymore, but she kept coming to church every Sunday. So I wrote her a note, and I said, I appreciate you coming to church, but why do you come? You can't hear the sermon, you can't hear the music, you can't talk to the people. She wrote me a note back and said, I don't come for the sermon. We know there are those of you like this. She said, I don't come for the music. She said, I don't even really come for the other people. She said, I come for God. She said, I found that since I can't hear, it's actually better. I don't get distracted in the silence. How does that happen? You know this in your own life. I missed last Sunday. Some of you are kind enough to say that you missed me last Sunday, but you got to hear Reverend Kim preach an absolutely splendid sermon that I caught last Sunday night. And the reason I wasn't here is it was Father's Day, and Lisa wanted us to go to Winston-Salem and sit in church with her dad for Father's Day, and then my three children, they pulled this off themselves. They managed all three to get there, like three grown children. This is nearly impossible. But they pulled it off. So we're all together. It was great. It was just lovely being with my children on Father's Day. And it made me start reminiscing about being a dad to my children. And we've done so many amazing things. And my son and I have ridden roller coasters all over the country, and we've been to France. We've done a lot of amazing things. Father and children, but really the most beautiful moments we've ever had, like between me and my children, have been times that we just were together. I remember when my kids were little, sometimes they'd just curl up next to me on the couch. We weren't doing anything, we weren't watching anything, we weren't talking. We were just together. There's so much love. So much love in that. This whole business of silence, if we were better at silence, I thought about this, like what goes wrong in our country politically, or the challenges that are facing our denomination. If we knew how to be quiet and listen, we'd do so much better. You see, we're always yakking all the time. We've got our ideology and we're chattering on and on, but we never listen. We never listen. If we could be still and listen, it would help us with God, right? In our praying, so much of our praying is I talk to God. And I say, Lord, hear my prayer. And I talk some more to God. But instead of saying, Lord, hear my prayer, we could just be quiet, be with God, and say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. It's being quiet. We have to own this, there are hard silences Loneliness is a kind of hard silence. Sometimes you can have that hard silence of loneliness, actually, when you're a big crowd of people that are talking, even talking to you. You can feel, even then, the hard silence that is loneliness. There's another hard silence. I thought about it a lot yesterday morning. Lisa and I drove back last night from, we have a conference every year with the Methodist. We go to Lake Junaluska, and people forget what's really important about that because we think about the business of the conference and the budget of the conference. That's important stuff. And then this year we're electing delegates to the conference. That's a big deal. Who gets elected? What's the denomination going to do? But the real wonder of annual conference is none of that. The real wonder of annual conference is the relationships. Over the years, I've become close friends, like family, with so many clergy. I love them. I'll always love them, their spouses. And what we did yesterday morning is what we do every year. Late on Saturday morning, every year during annual conference, we have a memorial service, and we remember the clergy and their spouses who have died in the past year, and the families sit together. Last year, I was in that family section myself. Lisa's mom, married to her dad, a pastor, had died. And then what we do in the service is we read the names of those who've died. They put their picture up on a screen. And when they read the name of someone who died, where you're seated, you can just stand in solidarity with the family, if it's somebody that you loved. I got to tell you, I stood up with a bunch of people yesterday. People that I've worked with, people that I've served with, people that I've laughed with, great friends, people I've preached their funerals. It's really something, that's the sign. I thought about, in that time, I thought about when my mother died back in February. And they called me and I drove down to the nursing home there, and I just sat with her, silence. Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, he was one of the great Christian heroes of the last century, a man of great courage, wonderful leader in the teeth of so much evil in Latin America. On Good Friday of 1980, this was just shortly before he was assassinated, right? On Good Friday of 1980, he preached a sermon, and he said this thing that I have to keep going back to myself, and I would encourage you to do the same. In that sermon, he said this: God is not failing us when we don't feel his presence. Let's not say God doesn't do what I pray for so much, and therefore I don't pray anymore. God exists, and he exists even more the farther you feel from him. God is closer to you when you think he is farther away and doesn't hear you. When you feel the anguished desire for God to come near because you don't feel him present, then God is very close to your anguish. How about that? When you feel like God is far away, that's when God is actually very close in the silence. I know I'm talking too long, but let me add this. This line of God is not in the storm, God was in the silence. God is not in the storm. When I was a little boy, when I was 7 years old, we lived in Charlotte for a number of months. My dad had just retired from a career in the Air Force. We were kind of transitioning into kind of his next stage of life. We lived in Charlotte for a while. We lived out on Wilkinson Boulevard in a trailer. This is amazing. And so we lived in that trailer on Wilkinson Boulevard, and one night there was a big electrical storm, maybe like the kind of storm that you had last night. And when you're in a trailer in a big electrical storm, I mean, that thing is shaking. It is absolutely terrifying. I am 7 years old, and in that day, I did not know much about God or church. My family didn't go very much, but I did go with my grandparents, and I went with my grandparents. They were lovely, humble people, but good grief, their preacher scared the daylights out of me. He did like the hellfire damnation thing, and I was trying to figure out God as a 7-year-old. And so that night when that storm was raging outside our trailer on Wilkinson Boulevard, I remember curling up on the floor and just thinking, God's coming to get me. God's angry. God knows that I'm a sinner. Like, how much sin can you commit when you're 7? I put gum under my desk. I don't know. What had I done? But I was terrified, and the good news is you don't have to be a 7-year-old child forever. You can grow up. And when you grow up, you learn God's not in the storm. God's not full of wrath coming to get you. God's not angry at you. God's in the quiet. God's in the peace. The reason that religious victories are always Pyrrhic is that God doesn't have sides. God is on everybody's side. God has mercy for all people. God's embrace reaches so far around all of us, you can't get away from it. You can't lose it. When you feel most alone, when the silence is so painful that you think, I can't deal. I got to turn something on. I can't deal. God is there. God is loving us. And if we can get that God is in the silence, then we can learn how to be silent. And we can learn how to listen to God. And we can learn how to listen to other people. And then we'll know the beauty. And we'll know the love, that we're never, ever alone. What a gift. What glory. Thanks be to God.